Hello everybody. This month the fine folk over on Patreon decided, amongst other things, that they wanted to hear what Drax's top 10 naval engineering disasters were. Now, there's plenty of ways you can categorise this. You could look at large-scale engineering disasters, things like, dockyards catching fire and ships collapsing on the stocks and such like. You can look at something incredibly systematic, like the failure of the 110-pounder Armstrong gun, or the various US attempts to build a high-velocity armour-piercing weapon, although it wasn't technically armour-piercing because no one had armour yet, in the 1850s, or much larger systemic engineering failures that maybe left a navy a generation behind in certain technologies at a time when it was cool to go to war with a technologically superior opponent. But if we did all of that, well, for one thing, any of the larger scale issues would take probably a video of their own to explain individually, and there'd be an awful lot of disagreement, I suspect, over which order things should be placed in. So instead, I decided to focus on individual ships or individual classes. Now, some of these ships and classes you will have heard of in other videos, and indeed some of these do have their own little 5-minute guides looking at their history and of course why they failed, but this video is going to look almost exclusively at the engineering failures inherent in those ships. Now, of course, there are a lot more than 10 classes of ship that could be classified as engineering failures, even in the past 150 years, let alone going further back than that. And I'm sure in the comments, plenty of you will be suggesting other candidates. However, these are the ones that stood out to me the most immediately when I first saw that this was going to be the suggestion. And one final thing, although it's a top 10 because I've been asked to do a top 10, this isn't in any particular order, except that I would say that probably the lower half, sort of 6 to 10 positions, would generally be considered slightly less of an engineering failure than the top 5, hopefully for reasons that you'll realise as the video goes on. So, with all that said, let's get into it. At number 10 on our list, the Spanish Infanta Maria Teresa class armoured cruisers. Now, what are they known for, other than losing their entire class at the Battle of Santiago de Cuba? Not much, to be honest. But the reason they're on this list is that they come at a time, in terms of their construction, where they represent a pinnacle of engineering failure, in my opinion. Now, that's not to say that other people didn't build armoured cruisers with similar failings. They did. The Orlando class of the Royal Navy is another good example. But the Royal Navy looked at the Orlando class when they were being built in the mid-1880s and went, this is a dumb idea. And whoever came up with this is also dumb. We're not going to do this anymore. And indeed wouldn't build another armoured cruiser for almost another 15 years. Instead going for protected cruisers. The Infanta Maria Teresa class, however, was built at the end of the 1880s. So they had plenty of time to evaluate why the Royal Navy had stopped building such ships. And whilst a few other powers, France, Russia, etc., were also building armoured cruisers, for the most part, they too had abandoned this particular design style and had gone for a different one that would made a bit more sense. Now, what is the design style we're talking about? Well, it's the layout of the main armour belt, because as the name suggests, an armoured cruiser has an armoured belt. Now, when you look at the 1880s and early 1890s designs of armoured cruiser, this is when they're all using compound armour before they bring in Harvey steel and then later Krupp steel and everything's able to be changed around again. You have 3 broad categories of how they're laying their armour out. Some, like a number of French armoured cruisers, choose to protect themselves against effectively the secondary and lesser guns of other armoured cruisers, what would be the primary battery of most protected cruisers, or maybe the secondary battery of some battleships, i.e. guns of approximately 6-inch caliber. And thus their armour is slightly thinner and somewhat more spread out, so there's a fairly good amount of coverage on the hull. Then you have 2 variants of the second type of armoured cruiser, And this type has a much, much thicker belt. Now, it might sound quite impressive, 10, 12 inches, something like that. It's quite common for this kind of design. But bear in mind, again, this is compound armour. So it's not the equivalent of 10 to 12 inches of Harvey or Krupp steel. Indeed, contemporary battleships in the mid to late 1880s are walking around or sailing around with 18, 20 inches plus of armour belt. So this is kind of half the thickness, which is actually roughly broadly equivalent to, let's say, a World War II or World War I cruiser that has a 6-inch belt or something along those lines. So 10 to 12 inches of compound armour, it gives a degree of protection against the heavier guns that armoured cruisers might be running around with. So 8.3-inch guns, 9.2-inch guns, maybe the odd 10-inch gun, but not much more than that. And one of the things you saw with armoured cruisers at the time, recognising this, was a few of them went for some fairly big, not quite battleship grade guns, but substantial weapons nonetheless. And indeed, the Infanta Maria Teresa class did this with two 11-inch guns, one fore and one aft. Now, again, you might be thinking, well, hang on, Drac, isn't 11-inch kind of the entry level for battleships? Well, yes and no. Yes, it is in the 20th century, but not in the 1880s. In the 1880s, we're talking a period just before the revolutions in metallurgy and propellant that would allow the 12-inch gun to be standardized as the average pre-dreadnought battleship gun. Again, at the time period we're talking about, this battleship gun is a 16-inch gun, a 16.5-inch gun, maybe even a 17.7-inch gun. There are some 13 or 13.5-inch guns floating around, and maybe a few 12-inch, but the trend is towards the much larger weapon. So an 11-inch gun in the mid to late 1880s is roughly the equivalent of an 8-inch gun in the interwar period World War II. So in a lot of ways, it's beginning to sound like perhaps the Infanta Maria Teresas are built along the same kind of lines as you'd expect to relate an 1920s heavy cruiser to contemporary battleships. And to a certain extent, you could make that argument because relationships between what is a cruiser and what is a battleship and what is a cruiser and what is a destroyer and so forth are broadly similar throughout the steam and steel period. Now, it's the specific way that armour is laid out that becomes the issue. You see, we mentioned there were two kinds of armour layout for this kind of thickness and protection. One of which looked at either making the cruiser quite large or sacrificing some other element from the speed, protection, firepower triangle. So obviously if you're maximising protection, perhaps your firepower would be less, or perhaps your speed would be less, and thus the save to displacement, if you're not making the ship massive, could spread the armour belt out a bit, because obviously being somewhat thicker than a 6 or 8-inch compound armour belt, the same amount of mass can only protect a smaller area. And so by saving displacement elsewhere, you can have it protect a larger area. So this was somewhat common, I wouldn't say entirely, but the more heavily protected armoured cruisers of this period did show this characteristic across a number of classes. Now, the weakness of the Orlando class, amongst others things, which is why the Royal Navy had abandoned the idea when they saw their performance, was that if you tried to build an armoured cruiser on a slightly smaller scale, but you also tried to maintain firepower and speed, and you went for the heavy protection, then you were going to end up with a very, very thin armour belt that didn't do all that much to help you. And indeed, with the Orlandos, because they were completed slightly overweight, it also meant that that armour belt spent most of its time underwater, which was less than helpful. Now, fast forward 5 years, and out come the Infanta Maria Teresas. They have their 10 to 12-inch thick armour belts, and it's only 5.5 foot high on a ship that, as you can see, has a fairly high freeboard. This is far, far from ideal. because the whole point of an armoured cruiser, as compared to a protected cruiser, is that the armour belt provides you with protection against incoming gunfire so that you can stay in the battle. Because of the displacement of the armoured cruiser having to be somewhat higher than what you can get away with small protected cruisers, you end up building a fairly expensive vessel, even if you build one that's small for an armoured cruiser. So you're not going to build that many of them. And so you end up in this kind of Ouroboros pattern of you need the armour to protect the ship. The ship becomes more expensive and larger because of that. Therefore, the armour definitely has to protect the ship because you can only have a few of them. And thus you increase the armour because the ship is now more valuable, which makes it cost more, which means you have less of them, which means you need more armour, and so on and so forth, which is how you end up in the situation of a 7,000-ton armoured cruiser with a 12-inch thick armour belt. The reason why the Infanta Maria Theresas are, to my mind, engineering failures is because they had the warnings with the Royal Navy abandoning the Orlando class. They had the warnings, to be honest, of anyone with common sense looking at the plans. And to a degree, they also had the warnings of how other nations who were still building armoured cruisers in the late 1880s and early 1890s were revising their ships' armoured schemes. And they chose to ignore all of that and build armoured cruisers with some of the thickest belts, but also some of the shortest belts in terms of height that the world would ever see, right at the end of the period that everybody was building these things. So these are kind of almost the last examples thereof, when they should have known better. And as a result, the Spanish Armada ended up with a ship that looked big and impressive. It had some fairly hefty guns, and therefore it was going to be deployed as a flagship or a flagship squadron to very important areas. It was going to attract a lot of heavy caliber gunfire, all of which would be fine to a degree as long as it had the protection to stand up to it, which of course, as I said, is the idea of an armoured cruiser, and it very much didn't. I mean, sure, if you hit the 5.5 foot high armoured belt with your incoming 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13-inch gun round, then sure, it probably stood a relatively decent chance of staying afloat. But at that point, actually hitting that armoured belt would be more of a feat of gunnery skill than anything else displayed in that battle, because, again, as you can see from the plans and from the pictures, there was an awful lot else of the ship, which was now unprotected, which you could hit. And indeed, other issues, mechanical issues, training issues, etc. aside, this proved to be one of the single biggest weaknesses of the class when they faced off against the US Navy at the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. Everything from 6-pounder shells to 4-inch, 5-inch, 6-inch, 8-inch and larger guns all inflicted significant damage on all three ships as they ran as part of the battle, and started fires which led to either explosions or the threat of explosions that would see all three knocked out of the fight. So, engineering failures because they look big and mean. That encourages you to send them into situations where they have to face off against big and mean things, and they actually have no protection against said big and mean things to any real degree. Something which will recur as a theme in some of these other ships. Next up, at the number 9 slot, we have the Issei-class battleships in their hybrid carrier conversion form. These are failures of such a huge degree. Now, as I have said before in other videos, in theory, purely looking at the technicalities of it, there is a place for the battle carrier in World War II, which is that if you can make it large enough in terms of flight deck and hangar space, you could conceivably use a battle carrier as a fighter carrier, i.e. a ship that sits with the rest of your carrier task forces and maybe carries a dozen, 2 dozen fighter aircraft, and it basically acts as your combat air patrol provider. So it's the ultimate escort ship. It's providing you with fighter cover to a certain degree. It's still got heavy guns, so in the event of a surface action, it can hopefully see off incoming enemy raiders, and let's face it, 8 14-inch guns in the Issei's case, which was what was left after the conversion, is still more than enough to deal with a heavy cruiser, light cruiser, anything like that. And being a ship of relatively substantial size, you can hopefully still pack a bunch of light, medium, heavyweight anti-aircraft guns in there as well, so it's got a double punch against incoming enemy strike craft. Sure, it's a bit vulnerable to incoming enemy battleships because, at least by World War II, 8 14-inch guns isn't exactly much to write home about in terms of battleship armament, and it has a lot of vulnerable fuel storage, munition storage, and burnable aircraft on its stern. But if you're in a situation where the enemy battleships have arrived in gun range of the carrier group you're escorting, you probably have larger things to worry about, like where are your dedicated battleships and why are they on fire? So, surely that makes them a good idea. Well, no, not really, because that, as I said, is a purely on-paper exercise. The larger issue is, why are you doing this? If you are going to have a battle carrier that's acting as your combat air patrol provider, that would suggest that your own carriers either can't provide it, or you need to load your fleet carriers with as many strike aircraft as possible and to hit the enemy as hard as possible, which means you're offloading the fighter duties to another ship. Which then raises the question of why are you doing that, and the only real answer for why you would do that, instead of having a dedicated battleship and a dedicated aircraft carrier or two, is that you are horribly outnumbered and you're looking to eke every last margin out of your fleet. And if you're that desperate, you have much, much larger issues to address than could possibly ever be solved by a battle carrier carrying a squadron or two of fighters. Oh, but it gets worse, because not only were the Issei and Hyuga stuck in this role of incredibly questionable utility, but they didn't even try to use them as fighter carriers. For some reason best known only to the dark secrets of World War II, they decided to equip them with a small complement of strike aircraft. Now bear in mind the context in which this takes place. This is the latter part of World War II. This is not an environment anymore where a dozen or fewer strike aircraft have any real hope of destroying anything other than maybe an isolated ship on its own. Against the kind of fleets that the US Navy, and then later by late 44, early 1945, the Royal Navy, were putting into the Pacific, 6 to a dozen strike aircraft are basically anti-aircraft gunner training bait. Now, could these strike aircraft perhaps have supplemented the strike groups of larger carrier aircraft? Yes, in theory, except that the larger carriers could carry those aircraft a lot more easily, maintain them more easily, had more fuel available to utilize them for more than one or two missions, and had more munitions to allow them to fly for more than that many missions. So if you're going to up the number of strike aircraft you need in your carrier air groups, again, as we discussed, it's probably better to put them on the fleet carriers. Fighters would use less fuel and wouldn't have to go as far anyway. So as well as being lighter, they wouldn't use as much fuel because they're being used on combat air patrol instead of long-range strike duty. But no, the plan was to use a pair of battleships as slow, very slow for carriers, battle carriers with a minuscule strike packet that would do not much other than ensure a few more Japanese pilots went to meet their honoured ancestors every time the ships went into action. And then on top of all of that, they didn't actually even equip the carriers with that extremely questionable strike group. They ended up carrying a handful of aircraft, which they never really used, and the ship's main claim to fame after their conversion was to be used as gigantic heavily armed cargo transports. They did take part in one major operation, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, as part of the Northern Decoy Force, where, as practically anyone with a sane mind could predict, their tiny handful of strike aircraft did exactly nothing against the mass forces that they were facing. Although, to be fair to them, they did prove to be slightly better at dodging the return American attacks than some of their main fleet carrier counterparts. And so you ended up with a pair of battleships that could no longer be used as frontline battleships, made exactly zero contribution to any kind of carrier warfare, and ended up costing the Japanese an awful lot of time and money to convert when, given their primary use after conversion, it would have just been a lot simpler to remove the aft gun turrets and barbettes, stick a big hole in the back and use them for the cargo transport that they actually ended up being the most useful for in the latter part of the war. So yes, one big, exhaustive engineering failure on so many levels. Coming in at number 8, we have the Courageous class in their large light cruiser form. This is a relatively short one. The Courageous class were built by Admiral Fisher, kind of dodging around the provision that the Treasury had put in place not to build any capital ships. He designated them instead as large light cruisers, and apparently the Treasury either were complicit in this or didn't bother to look past the cover page, because they're very blatantly not light cruisers in any way, shape or form. There's obviously still some debate as to what exactly they were for. Sometimes they're called light battle cruisers, but with their 4 15-inch guns, most people seem to agree that they were designed for Fisher's proposed Baltic campaign, whatever form that happened to take, and in the end didn't take because it wasn't authorised. But regardless of all of that, and the slightly questionable triple 4-inch secondary battery that also found its way into the Renown class, the reason that the Courageous class in this format are in this particular video is one very simple thing. Somebody, somewhere, took the light part of large light cruiser possibly a little bit too seriously, because these ships are over 20,000 tons and possessed all the structural rigidity of a wet noodle, something that was so bad it wouldn't be seen until probably something like, say, the Königsberger class in the interwar period. How bad was this? Well, the Courageous class' most deadly opponent was probably not the ships of the Kaiserliche Marine, but the North Sea, because when they were sent out, they twisted and buckled their own hulls simply by the action of running through a heavy sea, an action which literally every other ship in the fleet was perfectly capable of accomplishing, and they failed in a fairly spectacular manner as well, with sheared rivets, buckled hull plates, leaks into fairly large compartments such as their torpedo flats, and so on and so forth. They rather rapidly had to be taken back in and given a fair degree of structural stiffening in order to make them, not shake themselves and twist themselves apart simply by proceeding at speed through the water. They also proved more susceptible than the average ship to damaging themselves through the blast of their own guns when they saw their one bit of surface action at the Second Battle of Heligoland Bight. And before the war was even over, the last vessel of the class, HMS Furious, was already under conversion to an aircraft carrier, because that was a far, far more practical role for the long, thin, high-speed vessel. And indeed, both Courageous and Glorious would also be converted to aircraft carriers pretty quickly, once the Washington Naval Treaty explicitly gave that opportunity, with both Courageous and Glorious after the war having almost immediately been decommissioned and sent into the reserve, despite having been some of the newest ships in the fleet. So, yeah, engineering failures on the grounds of, well, enemy gunfire only came third on the list of things most likely to cause damage to these particular vessels. At number 7, we have another product of the Royal Navy in World War I, the K-Class. Now, somewhat surprisingly, there are a number of defences for the K-Class, which will be explored when I end up doing a video about the class as a whole. The overall idea of the K-Class was a very early iteration of the fleet submarine concept, something that didn't actually end up working out in the long term, which is essentially the idea of a submarine's big enough and fast enough to stay on the surface and move with the battle fleet, and then when you get to the battle area, submerge and do their submarine thing. And this addresses one of the biggest problems, in fact the biggest problem, when it comes to utilising submarines in a battle line tactical role in the First and Second World Wars, namely the fact that a surface submarine is generally incapable of getting to the area fast enough, and then obviously if it gets there much later there's not a lot to do because the battle has been decided one way or the other. So with the K-class designed to be able to hit 24 knots on the surface at a time when the Royal Navy's battle line speed was 21 knots, they showed a fair degree of promise, and their design actually predates World War I. The concept, therefore, is actually not too bad. On paper, these subs will easily keep pace with the fleet, and then if they can dive at a relatively opportune moment, bearing in mind the overall speed and time that a battle line engagement in World War I takes, they could very well have a rather decisive effect. So if you think to perhaps the Battle of Jutland, okay, Jellicoe didn't get a tremendous amount of warning as to where exactly the enemy was, but thanks mostly to the light cruisers, he did know that the enemy was coming. So a squadron of K-class present with Jellicoe at Jutland, once Jellicoe had given the order to deploy the fleet to port, should, or possibly could, in theory, have been able to douse their fires, dive, and manoeuvre to a position ahead of the battle line, at which point, as Scheer appears through the murk, they could have volleyed off quite a few torpedoes at him and made the life of the High Seas Fleet very uncomfortable indeed. In theory. The overarching problem with this idea is that, well, the K-class weren't ready in time for Jutland, and by the time they were ready, the First World War was almost over and the High Seas Fleet chance of coming out to fight was pretty low. And then once you got into the interwar period with the Washington Naval Treaty, etc., the battle line speed of at least the Japanese and British battle lines increased such that the speed margin that they had on paper was no longer really a margin of advantage. So you could make the argument that their on-paper capabilities and their overall design did have some merit for a short period, which happened to mostly coincide with their build and shakedown trials times. And by the time they were fully in service, that margin had closed, and the idea of a fleet submarine, whilst it would be revisited multiple times, would never actually quite work out due to the advances in surface ship technology. But the engineering that went into them, that is somewhat more of an issue, and that's why they're on this list. Now, the inclusion of the steam engines, from an engineering perspective, despite the increased amount of dive time that this gave the subs, isn't actually too much of an issue for me. Yes, it does make them less capable than your average submarine, but then they're designed for a very specific role as compared to your average submarine, and in that particular role, an emergency dive time of 5 minutes when it takes longer than that for the fleet to shake out into a battle line is actually not too much of a problem. It would be a problem if you utilise them in anything other than their design role, which can be argued separately, but from a design perspective, it's not actually a massive issue, at least to me. The larger engineering issues come from how this was implemented. The first iteration of the K-class, before they received their rather distinctive modified and large bows, included such wonderful habits as digging their bows into the ocean as they tried to proceed forward at high speed, which not only slowed them down but could lead to some unanticipated impromptu diving, which was never a good thing, even on a more conventional submarine. And their freeboard was so limited that rough seas could cause water to pour down into the boilers and put them out. Now, granted, it's a submarine, it's not supposed to have a particularly high freeboard, but again, if you are going to stick steam engines into a submarine, this is the kind of thing you probably should be thinking about and trying to address. Collapsible funnels on warships had been around since at least HMS Warrior. They're not that difficult to implement. And despite being big, expensive submarines, they had an approximate maximum diving depth of around 200 feet, which was about 140 foot less than the overall length of the submarine. So yes, this did mean that in the event of something going particularly weird and the submarine ending up standing vertically in the water, you could have 50 foot of the stern poking up out of the water in the air, and the bow would still reach crush depth and implode. And it wasn't like the Royal Navy couldn't build submarines with a deeper max diving depth. Contemporary subs, and indeed designs that had been developed slightly before the K-class, had maximum diving depths of 250 to 300 feet. Now, granted, this is still less than the maximum length of the monstrous K-class, but it would be a somewhat better scenario given that 200 feet could be exceeded if the submarine was at a down angle of 36 degrees from the surface with the stern on the surface. Couple that with the fact their diving controls weren't actually that reliable or precise, and the internal bulkheads only being rated for about 40% of the maximum diving depth, and it meant that every time one of these subs submerged, there was a much, much higher than comfortable chance that they would wander below their maximum diving depth purely through happenstance, and if that happened, there was nothing that anybody aboard the full 339-foot length of the submarine could do if something failed, because the bulkhead, sure as anything, weren't going to save you. Now, there were other issues, such as the fact that they were about as agile as a brick, but most of those, I think, pale into insignificance compared to those core engineering issues which we've just highlighted, because ultimately, a submarine is supposed to be a warship, or a vessel, I suppose, if you have a civilian one, that can submerge safely and hold itself at depth safely, and then come back again. And the K-class, despite all the other faults, fundamentally really kind of failed at reliably doing this simple, essential function of being a proper submarine. Inhabiting the number 6 spot is the Corbeil class, the first French dreadnoughts. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with the ships. They do stay afloat, and indeed some of them are even still in service in World War II. But from an engineering perspective, given the context of their time, they are pretty bad. So how exactly? Well, let's compare them to their contemporaries. So the Corbeils are laid down in the latter part of 1910 and then 1911. So you're looking at other classes of ship that were laid down in 1910 and 1911. Well, the other three big navies that are laying down ships at this point, the Germans, the British and the Americans. So the Corbeils have a maximum armour thickness of 11 inches. They have 6 12-inch guns with 2 twin turrets forward, 2 twin turrets aft, and 1 twin turret on each wing. So they have a total of a 10-gun broadside. And they can make 21 knots. So when you look at them compared to the contemporaries, the Kaisers, the Orions, and the Wyomings, well, the Wyomings have 12 12-inch guns, so the same number of guns, but all of the Wyomings are on the centerline, so they have a 2-gun broadside advantage. The Orions, the first super dreadnoughts, are equipped with a 13.5-inch gun. They have everything also on the centerline, so although they only have 10 guns as opposed to the 12 on the Wyoming, again, they have a 10-gun broadside, so they have the same number of guns on the broadside as the Corbeil, but they're much heavier weapons. The Kaisers have 10 12-inch guns, so the lowest gun and shot weight count of all of them, and whilst they also have wing turrets, unlike the Corbeils, the wing turrets do have a degree of cross-firing capability, so at least at some angles, the Kaisers have a 10 12-inch gun broadside. So, in optimum conditions, the Kaisers and the Corbeils are tied for broadside weight, at least without looking at the details of shell weight and rate of fire. The Wyomings are a step above them, and the Orions, whilst they're still only 10-gun broadside, do have the heavier guns. Speed-wise, everybody's at 21 knots, so it's okay. The Corbeils are a little bit on the bottom bar, but they're not too bad yet. Armour-wise, however, the Kaisers have just under 14 inches of armour, the Orions have about 12 inches of armour, the Wyomings have 11 inches of armour, and the Corbeils have just a fraction over 10.5 inches of armour, so they're the least well protected. So, joint bottom firepower, everyone's the same on speed, but least protection. So the Corbeys end up at the bottom of the pile. And ironically enough, the one that they share the bottom of the pile firepower with, the Kaisers, are at the top of the pile protection-wise. So why exactly is the Corbeil showing up as an engineering failure as opposed to just, not a particularly brilliant example of a dreadnought in an era when everybody's making advancements in their dreadnoughts quite quickly? Well, it's that combination of armour belt along with the armament. The armament fails on two levels. The smallest issue is the fact they're still using wing turrets, as everyone else is either using centerline or en echelon, so it's an inefficient layout. The Germans and the British and the Japanese have used it before, but everyone else at this point has abandoned it to one degree or another, so that's not brilliant. But the larger problem is tied into the doctrine under which they were designed. The French still thought that battles would be fought at very short ranges compared to everybody else, and they were so determined on that the main armament was designed with a very limited maximum elevation, only 12 degrees, and this meant that the Corbeil's relatively small broadside could only go out to a maximum range of just under 15,000 yards, and in practice somewhat less than that. This was well below, as it turned out, what battles could actually be fought at reliably. Admittedly, the Germans also had as limited elevation, and the British had some other issues in that whilst their guns could elevate higher, on some of their ships the gun sighting prisms only went up to 15 degrees elevation, but with that, the guns themselves could actually fire a lot further at 15 degrees elevation than you'd think a 3-degree difference in elevation would otherwise provide, because they were bigger, more powerful weapons. And to cap it all off, the secondary battery could elevate higher than the main battery. Okay, that's not necessarily too bad a thing, because, they're lighter weapons, it's slightly easier to elevate them higher, but it meant that the Corbeil's secondary battery could shoot further by a considerable margin, just over 2,000 yards, further than the main battery could. So who exactly was expecting a dreadnought to be engaging in pre-dreadnought hail of fire style tactics? I mean, okay, it's a little bit embarrassing that your secondary battery outranges your main, and you could say that, well, that was French doctrine. They absolutely thought they were going to fight at closer ranges, so it makes sense to minimise the openings in the gun ports. But apart from that minor issue, I mean, if you really, really believe the range is going to be that short, then you should be equally trying to protect your secondary batteries. The larger issue comes from the combination of the guns with the armour, because remember we said the armour is the thinnest of the contemporary dreadnoughts. If you really think, in an era when people are running around with, relatively high velocity 12-inch guns and 13.5-inch weapons in the case of the British, if you really think that in that environment battles are going to be fought at an incredibly short range, you should be armouring your ship up a lot, because at short range those guns are going to have very high penetration characteristics. And instead you end up with a ship that can't fight at long range, where possibly its armour might provide a degree of protection, at least against 12-inch gunfire, and when it comes into short range, its armour provides basically no protection against any contemporary battleship. At which point you kind of have to ask, what's the point of having the armour in the first place, apart from maybe fighting off the odd cruiser? So the Corbeils are on this list for having taken one set of design choices that limits their combat capability, and then in other sets of design choices made them pretty awful even at their limited capability they've decided to inflict upon themselves. It's the double whammy that does it for me. Coming in at number 5, we have another favourite punching bag of mine, the Königsberg class, and to a lesser degree the related Leipzig class. Now, there are various things you can pick apart when it comes to the Königsbergs as light cruisers. They've not got the world's thickest belt armour, their protection is pretty substandard. Armament is okay, especially for their size, and speed, at least when they work, is also relatively okay for their size. So on paper, apart from maybe a fraction less than useful protection, there's not a lot to criticise about them, and the lack of protection can to a certain extent be forgiven by the fact that whilst they are light cruisers, they're not 10,000-tonner light cruisers like the Megamis theoretically were, or the Brooklyns, or the Towns, etc. They are 6,000-ton standard displacement cruisers, so it's more fair to compare them to something like an Arethusa, or one of the smaller Italian cruisers. And as I said, on paper, they can kind of stand up fairly well in that particular category. However, shades of the Courageous class showing up here, their hulls were incredibly weak for warships. They suffered from twisting, they suffered from cracks, they suffered from practically every kind of engineering fault that you could imagine when it comes to poor design calculations leading to a hull that is singularly unsuited for the task. It came down to the point where, when they're using fuel from the fuel tanks, they had to siphon the fuel from specific tanks further out and then draw in on the tanks amidships, because if they did it the other way around, which on a normal warship wouldn't be too much of an issue, it would cause overstressing in the hull and, the ship might break apart in rough seas. This is further complicated by the fact that whilst measures could be taken to address these issues to a degree, it made the ships slower, which is not a good thing when it's a cruiser, and it also meant that the amount of fuel available was significantly reduced, because much like some of the German destroyers, you either had to keep the fuel in the tanks to maintain the ship's overall stability, or you just couldn't use as much, so the ships went out lighter with less fuel aboard. Whilst being somewhat larger, the Leipzigs didn't suffer from this to the same degree as the Königsbergs. They still had these issues to a much greater degree than was otherwise acceptable. And this badly limited the utility of the class. I mean, they're fast, light cruisers on paper. They're not really going to win a straight-up gunfight with a 10,000-tonner treaty-era light cruiser, so it would seem, given that the Germans have a predilection for surface raiding, especially in the early part of the war, that they should, between the 5 of them, make ideal surface raiders. Now, granted, by the end of the Norwegian campaign, Königsberg and Karlsruhe were already sunk, but Köln, Leipzig and Nuremberg, again on paper, should have made decent surface raiders to support the Hippers, the Deutschlands and the Scharnhorsts. And their original stated maximum range would have allowed them to do this. But, as we just said, in order to address the various weaknesses to make sure that they didn't just work themselves apart even at closer range waters, the amount of fuel that they could use was so badly limited that it would make a transatlantic raiding mission basically impossible. So they couldn't really go out into the Atlantic because they'd probably get badly damaged, if not potentially crippled or sunk, just by Atlantic storms. And even if you were prepared to take that risk, they couldn't go into the Atlantic anyway because they didn't have enough fuel after all the various design considerations to keep them afloat just in regular waters had been done. So when you compare that against the mission profile of a cruiser generally, or even a small light cruiser more specifically, and thanks to a variety of engineering failures, the Königsbergs and the Leipzigs were just incapable of doing most of the jobs that they were supposed to have done. At number 4, we have the USS Galena, or Galena, or Galena, depending apparently on which region of the US you're from. I'm going to call it Galena because that's easy enough for me. In any case, this vessel has its own video explaining a lot of the problems with it, but in short, it was designed as one of 3 successful bids for an ironclad to face off against what would turn out to be CSS Virginia. The other 2 being USS New Ironsides, which took a lot longer to make, and USS Monitor, which I think fortunately for everybody concerned was the ship that actually got sent down to the Battle of Hampton Roads. Galena tried some unique ways of rigging up its armour, but ultimately as an engineering issue, the problem for Galena, at least in my book, is that there had been plenty of tests of guns versus armour by the point at which she was designed. These tests had been done in the US, they'd been done in Britain, they'd even been done in France and Russia to a certain degree, and even private industries in other countries had done so. So the results are out. There was a decent body of evidence as to how much armour you needed in order to stop certain kinds of guns. Galena was then installed with nowhere near the minimal amount. Her armour, as it turned out, was just about thick enough to stop rifle fire, shrapnel fragments, and the occasional lighter weight shot that came in from an exceptionally long range, but nothing in the caliber that you would be facing fighting fortifications or fighting other ships at anything approaching what counted for battle range at the time of the American Civil War. And when she was called upon to engage an enemy gun battery at Drury's Bluff, she ended up having to withdraw with numerous casualties and having failed to achieve her objective. Fundamentally, her armour was just thick enough to be a problem and not thick enough to be of any help, which puts it in a very specific category of engineering failure, because she probably would actually have been better off without her armour entirely, which is actually how she would end up in her career. Firstly, the problem was that shot punching through the armour tended to turn the armour itself into a cloud of shrapnel, and the resistance caused by the armour was often just enough to cause the shot itself to also break up. So instead of a cone of wood splinters and a lump of albeit lethal metal coming through the side, the crew was instead faced with a spray of wood and iron that fanned out in order to cut down anything in its path. You can basically make a very, very good argument, as said, that if Galena had engaged Drury's Bluff in her unarmoured form, which would happen afterwards, she probably would have done a lot better, because she would have had more guns to use against her enemies, and the shots that did strike her would have caused less casualties to her crew. Of course, you can make the argument in that case that maybe the Confederate gunners would have used explosive shells, but one would hope that Union Navy officials wouldn't send an unarmoured warship into point-blank range from shell-firing guns. But the other issue is simply that because she had armour, it encouraged Union officers to mistakenly commit her to a fight which required protection, whilst also being in a position where that protection was entirely inadequate. It's literally the worst possible combination of factors. The fact that Galena wasn't sunk or blown up in that engagement is really more down to luck than judgment, and so she joins the small and not particularly glorious group of ships that are equipped just enough to persuade officers to send them into danger, and not actually equipped anywhere near enough to handle that danger. Next at the number 3 slot, we have the Swedish ship Vasa. Of course, you could probably see this one coming. Poor old ship didn't even make it out of its maiden voyage before keeling over and toppling into the sea, which is a pretty disastrous engineering failure. Now, for those of you who have seen the ongoing Vasa series, where Dr. Fred Hocker talks about Vasa, again, the thing is, it's not that the designers were incompetent. The Vasa was a very new type of ship. It had a very new type of layout, new type of design, very heavy broadside for its period, 2-decker, almost entirely 24-pounder guns. In periods of ship development, mistakes are going to be made, and some of those mistakes are going to be pretty bad. So someone somewhere was going to build a ship that did what Vasa did. And of course, before Vasa went down, the British ship, or at that time English ship, Mary Rose, had sunk. But although both ships keeled over in a strong wind and ended up capsizing and going down to the bottom, the circumstances were somewhat different. Mary Rose didn't go down on her maiden voyage. She had 3.5 decades of service behind her at the time, and she had been refitted from her original form. Vasa was a purpose-designed, if you like, gunship, and this was the first time she'd actually sailed out of Stockholm Harbour. But nonetheless, a combination of factors led to her being perhaps a little bit too thin for her height. Her decks were perhaps a little bit too tall, And this meant that a combination of lots of bronze guns high up in the ship, combined with a side wind, combined with the high fore and after castles, combined with the sails and the masts and the rigging, meant the whole thing just rolled over and sank. So a fairly major engineering disaster, because, well, you've engineered a ship that can't stay upright, which is a fundamental part of what constitutes being a ship. So, a relatively brief entry, but not really one that needs a tremendous amount more explanation, because, after all, if your ship won't stay on the surface 5 minutes into your maiden voyage, it's pretty easy to understand why you don't want to be on that ship. And speaking of ships that refuse to stay upright, HMS Captain, our entry for number 2, the Royal Navy's last civilian-designed naval vessel, and the vessel that would allow the Royal Navy to put a very, very firm foot down thereafter and say, no, we'll design the warships from now on, thank you very much. Captain, again, has its own video, and was the result of an awful lot of bickering internally, technically, within the Navy, as its leading advocate was Captain Cowper Coles, who was actually part of the Royal Navy, and, to his credit, a fairly competent designer of turrets. He had, in fact, designed the Coles turret, shockingly enough, and this would prove to be the ancestor of the modern turret via a somewhat circuitous route. But he had ambitions to design a ship. He got enough political backing to get the ship built over the objections of the Navy. But when it was launched, it turned out that, well, even before the inevitable happened, it was far from an ideal warship. It rolled badly, its gunnery accuracy was pretty terrible, and it was not exactly the most pleasant of ships to live on. But ultimately, its fate would come about in a storm that the rest of the fleet it was with rode out with relatively minimal damage, but thanks to a combination of it being overweight and hilariously unstable compared to practically every other ironclad warship ever constructed, when the wind got properly going, she first began to heel, then she began to flood, then the free surface effect came in, and in a very, very, very short time, she rolled over and sank, taking basically everybody with her. So again, brief entry, but like Vasa, something that doesn't need a lot of explanation. It's a complete engineering disaster, because it wouldn't have made a particularly brilliant warship even if it had somehow magically stayed afloat, and as it turned out, within a few months of commissioning, she wouldn't be afloat anymore, and it was exactly what everybody who actually knew what they were doing had said would happen right from the start. And finally, we come to our number 1 spot. This is one that, even more than the Königsberg class, is a favourite bugbear of mine. It's not even a whole class, because 2 out of the 3 ships of this particular class did have some modifications that somewhat mitigate the issue. So we're down to one very specific ship. HMS Indefatigable. Lead ship of the Indefatigable class battle cruisers, albeit, as I said, HMAS Australia and HMS New Zealand were somewhat different. Now, why is Indefatigable here at the top? Well, it's very simple, but also somewhat complex. So, Indefatigable has been criticised for many reasons. Some point out that she doesn't offer that much in terms of speed or firepower over the Invincible class at a time when the Germans were beginning to think about and then actually laying down Von der Tann. Others have said that, well, related to that, Fisher wanted to build what was effectively a prototype Lion, and that would have been a much better choice. I agree with that. And others have pointed out that Indefatigable used cross-deck firing turrets, much like the Invincible class did, and whilst they had slightly better cross-deck firing capability, it still wasn't brilliant, and they would have been much better off with an all-centerline layout. I agree with that too. These are all valid criticisms. That's not what makes the Indefatigable class an engineering disaster. The fact that she exploded at Jutland also actually is the main reason I'm calling her an engineering disaster, although that was a fairly big disaster, because ultimately neither the Invincible nor the Indefatigable class were ever designed to be there.
No, the problem with the Indefatigable class comes from the role she was actually designed for and how the designers went about fulfilling it. And the reason she's at the top of this list is because the designers knew better in the first place and then made it actively worse. So yes, people have criticised the Indefatigable for not offering all that much more than Invincible. I would actually say she's categorically a worse vessel. Why, though? Well, let's look at the design profile of the Invincible class. The Invincibles were never designed to fight ships with 12-inch guns. They were dreadnought armoured cruisers. They were supposed to fight enemy armoured cruisers, ships equipped with 7.5-inch guns, 8.3-inch guns, maybe 6-inch guns, etc. and so on. They were designed to be faster than them, they were designed to outgun them, and they were designed with armour that was capable of withstanding at reasonable battle ranges any kind of firepower that an armoured cruiser could put at them in return. They were designed to hunt down enemy armoured cruisers, kill them horribly, and secure the high seas for British trade. And, as was proven at the Battle of the Falkland Islands, the Invincible class were perfectly capable of doing this. They were very good at their job, they were very well designed for their job. Of course, when you put something that's got 6-inch armour up against something with 12-inch guns, things tend not to go quite so well, but, as I said, the Invincibles were not designed to face off against enemy battleships. That was a role that they were shoehorned into later on. And, of course, the Germans unhelpfully came up with their own battle cruisers, which now meant you had battle cruiser fights, which, for all intents and purposes, when it comes to armour protection, amounts to the same thing, because they're all carrying the same calibers of armament. But, whilst you can legitimately criticise putting the Invincibles and the Indefatigables in a role that they were never designed for, and you can't really be that surprised when they do very badly at it. No, the problem with the Indefatigables, or Indefatigable herself specifically, is that she's actively worse than an Invincible at doing her original job. You see, as mentioned, the Invincibles had P and Q turrets in an echelon fire, with some cross-deck firing. Didn't work out particularly brilliantly, except on very narrow bearings, and one of the things that the Indefatigable class offered, in fact one of the few things the Indefatigable class offered, was that the ships were somewhat longer and there was a bit more space amidships, and so P and Q turrets could fire across deck, depending on which way the ship was facing, a bit more successfully and across somewhat wider arcs. But there were limitations on the design in terms of, wanting to keep up a similar amount of speed, but the ships have gotten larger, so what are you going to do in order to get the ships to have the same amount of firepower, although better utilised, and the same amount of speed? If you're not allowed to put the overall displacement and power plant up too much, well, armour is going to be sacrificed. Except that, of course, the 6-inch armour was specifically designed to be proof against incoming armoured cruiser fire at medium battle ranges. And what did they do on the Indefatigables? Well, they kept the 6-inch armour amidships, so the machinery was fine. P and Q turret magazines were fine. A and X magazines, however, the fore and aft guns, the guns that have the greatest arcs of fire, the guns that are the single most useful weapons on the ship, well, their sides are now protected by a grand total of 4 inches of armour plate. And guess what? At medium battle ranges, at least as far as medium battle ranges were considered to be in the 1900s and 1910s, and proved to be during World War I, the typical main weapon of your average armoured cruiser, whether that be a 194mm French gun, a 8 or 10-inch American gun, a 9.2-inch British gun, or an 8.3-inch German gun, was more than capable of punching through 4 inches of armour. So you've taken a ship that is big, expensive, and therefore only going to be available in small numbers, designed specifically for killing armoured cruisers, and made it proof against those armoured cruisers, and then to improve the design, you've turned it into a ship that can be magazine detonated by those armoured cruisers. Spoiler alert, this is not an improvement. This is how you lose ships. For a ship that was designed to kill armoured cruisers, the vast majority of last generation armoured cruisers were actually better protected across their magazines than Indefatigable was. So, whilst, yes, Indefatigable exploded because she was put in entirely the wrong situation at Jutland, if Indefatigable had been sent to the Battle of the Falkland Islands, there's every chance that von Spee aboard Scharnhorst, or possibly Gneisenau, if Scharnhorst had already been put down, would have been able to destroy the Indefatigable, despite the fact that Indefatigable was specifically designed to destroy him. Slow handclap all around to whichever muppet came up with that particular design decision. You know, the Death Star might have a thermal exhaust port, and Achilles might have his heel. But this design decision was the equivalent of making that giant dish on the Death Star, you know, the thing that fires the planet-killing laser, also the thermal exhaust port. Or perhaps Achilles being some horrible mutant hybrid monster that was 25% heel by volume. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, my candidate for the single worst engineering disaster of all time, at least for the ships covered in this period, because unlike Captain, and unlike Vasa, these designers could have known better, should have known better, and actively went out to make a ship that was fundamentally unsuited to the one job it actually had.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.